Right, good afternoon and welcome to the Vermont Legislature's House Committee on Environment and Energy. This afternoon, we're going to continue taking testimony on S-100, the housing bill, and we're going to welcome Kathy Beyer. Welcome. Oh, you are muted.
All right, is that better?
That is better.
Thanks. Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Madam Chair, and to the whole committee. I wish I could be there in person, but I came down with my first head cold in 3 years, and you do not want my germs in your committee room. So
Thank you for that.
good to have a virtual option.
Yes.
I want to start off on a little bit of a philosophical note, and I want to say that a decent and affordable home is as essential as having clean air and clean water. Everyone needs a secure home so that they can lead a good life, right? And we know this, like affordable homes support our physical and mental well-being. And just as state government has a role in ensuring that we have clean air to breathe, government has a role in ensuring that we all have decent and affordable homes. And that is why I think that this housing bill at this point in time is essential. So I'd like to start off by talking about two aspects of S-100. One relates to the local density, and the other is parking. So first, I cannot stress enough how much that land that is connected to town water and sewer should be considered a precious resource in a community. Just as we conserve our farmland, we should look at how we are using our land that is connected to town water and sewer and understand it's a finite resource. And it is the only way we are going to be able to build the density needed to address this housing crisis is to look to land on town water and sewer. And Section 2 of S-100 recognizes this, but stating that a zoning district served by municipal water and sewer, where you can build single-family homes, you could build a fourplex. And goes on to say that on that land, zoned residential, will have a density of at least 5 units per acre. And if I had one critique of this bill, is that we might even look to a higher density than 5 units per acre. I understand some folks are offended by this requirement. Why should the state mandate density to the towns? But the flip side is, why do we continue to consume so much of our land and infrastructure resources for single family homes to the exclusion of housing with more density? We have been doing that for decades. And many of our children and grandchildren are not going to be able to afford a home, even on 1/5 of an acre, but might be more than happy to be living in a duplex or a quadplex. So I can give you a real world example about how hard it is to find developable land on town water and sewer. And it's for a larger multifamily project, but I can tell you any developer that I speak to has the same sentiment, like, yes, it is hard to find land on town water and sewer. So 10 years ago, Tropical Storm Irene hit. And in West Brattleboro, the Brattleboro Housing Authority had 80 units of public housing in the floodway and floodplain of the Whetstone Brook. All 80 units were flooded, and it was critical that we build new housing and move those elderly and disabled tenants out of Melrose Terrace and to new safe housing. And we did that in the first phase. We built 55 beautiful units of senior housing right near the Brattleboro High School. But we still had 25 people left living in this place that was not safe for them. I looked for 3 years for land on town water and sewer where we could build these 20 to 25 more units. It took us 3 years. And do you know where we built? We built phase 2 right next to the 55 units, which was already at a density of 20 units an acre. We added phase 2 and we are at a density of 26 units per acre. Now, I'm not going to suggest that's the kind of density that needs to be mandated, but I just want to stress how important this issue is. And S100 takes a step to addressing that. And think about it. We, the state, is finally directing significant resources to towns to upgrade their town water and sewer. So the timing of this legislation in concert with that investment, I think is absolutely essential. The second area I want to talk about is parking, and I know you've had some testimony on parking. For years, it was standard in most zoning to require, much zoning to require 2 units per acre. And I will say many towns have revised their zoning ordinance and they are not requiring 2 spaces per unit, but it does happen. And why do I care as a developer? It's not really the cost of the parking. It's that the requirement of having 2 spaces per acre becomes, it's just actually ends up limiting the number of, in my case, of the apartments we can build. So Evernorth, along with our partners all across the state, are directed by the state housing funders. We want you to build in our downtowns, our village centers, our growth centers. And those locations mean we are building on tight infill sites. They don't have a lot of extra land. So if that's where we're building and we need to have 2 spaces per unit, by math, we're going to build less housing. And I have a real world example of this in the town of Stowe. Not to pick on Stowe, but it is very difficult to build affordable housing in Stowe due to the land costs. It's just it is. So when we had the opportunity, it was the first year of the pandemic, and we had the opportunity to acquire 14 apartments right on a mile from downtown in Stowe. And 9 of the units were under new construction, and the private developer had planned to bring it online as Airbnb, and thank goodness decided to sell that building to us. And then we had a 3-unit building that easily could have been converted to 4 apartments, like at very little cost, could have been 4 apartments. But we did not have any room to add 2 more spaces. So we had to pass that up. And I have to tell you, it was really hard for me because I know how hard it is to get affordable housing in Stowe. So because of the 2 spaces per unit requirement, we were not able to add that additional apartment. And the other thing about parking lots is that they're impervious surface. So really, if you're overbuilding on your parking, that also means that you're creating more stormwater runoff. I'm going to switch. If people want to stop me while I'm rambling, please let me know, but I'll keep going. I'd like to talk briefly about Section 13 in regards to the state energy code. So the Residential Building Energy Code is a very complex building code. It's over 100 pages long. And the Department of Public Service is mandated by statute to update that code every 3 years. And when they do that update, it's a very robust process. They talk with all the stakeholders. They use consultants who are professional in this field. And the statute says that an energy code the update will consider energy efficiency, housing policy, and cost of the code update to Vermonters. And they do that every 3 years. So at the state level, the Department of Public Service is looking at this balance between energy efficiency and energy equity. And I don't believe individual towns have the staff in place to assess both energy efficiency and energy equity. So Section 13 supports towns to say, go ahead and adopt the stretch code. And the stretch code is on a path to getting to net zero for all new construction by 2030. That is not far away. So we have one of the most robust energy codes in the country. And I think it's important to keep that consistency among the towns. And one of the reasons is if I, as a developer, have a patchwork of energy codes that my architect, my mechanical engineer, my electrical engineer, everybody has to understand and change the building accordingly, it will drive up housing costs. So I think that is an important section of S100. Lastly, I will provide limited testimony on the Act 250 provisions. And I want to, Evernorth is one of the largest multifamily developers in the state. You may not see our name on the projects because every project we do is in partnership with what we call our local partners, such as Champlain Housing Trust or Addison County Community Trust. And because of the financing, every project has a different name and as a limited partnership. But we have participated in many Act 250 applications and permits over our 35-year history. And we have benefited greatly from the exemption provided by priority housing projects. And we strongly support priority housing projects and possibly expanding that exemption in appropriate growth areas. We find the Act 250 process to be highly professional and honestly more predictable than the local permit process. However, it adds time, money, and another possibility for a permit appeal. And when, as I listened to some of the discussion around Act 250, and a lot of focus gets put on Act 250, but you also have to get all your underlying state permits, right? The state water, wastewater, the state stormwater. And because of with good reason, the Act 250 permit can't get released until you have all those underlying state permits, some of which take a long time to get. And that means you don't have your Act 250 permit yet. So the appeal period hasn't started on the Act 250 permit. And that means as a developer, you continue to be at risk, and you tend to slow down. You want to be careful about spending a lot of money on pre-development, on construction drawings, until you get past that appeal period. So in some ways, it's not the process of Act 250 that causes heartburn among developers. It's this kind of time and risk of another appeal that brings us heartburn. But, that being said, Act 250 is not the central reason we are in a housing crisis. The entire country is experiencing a housing crisis for a multitude of reasons. But I do agree with some of the changes that are proposed. I think it is time to look at the jurisdictional thresholds of 10 units per acre. That's been the threshold for 50 years. But I also recognize that that's a significant change. I mean, that's going to have an impact on the landscape of Vermont, and in doing so should be done under careful consideration. Personally, I have thought that the 5-mile rule is outdated. And I have seen many examples of private developers building 9 units and stopping because of this rule. But I'm going to conclude my remarks by saying reinstating what I said at the beginning. We are at a moment in time where increasing our zoning density is essential. It is a matter of equity. It is a matter of how we use our finite resource of land on town water and sewer. And as well, it is a matter of adding more housing of all sizes to our communities. Thanks so much.
Thank you for your testimony. Do members have questions? Seeing any right now. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Okay, next up, we have Chris Cochran joining us.
Need to be able to just to share screen.
Is it frozen? Oh, there it goes.
There we go. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. My name is Chris Cochran. I'm the Director of Community Planning and Revitalization, and I'm here as you step back to just give you an overview of the state designation programs. I'm sure you've heard a lot about them. They have done a lot of good, but there are a lot of them and they do different things. And I think when you're looking at Active 50 jurisdiction in towns, and I think it's probably a healthy step back to kind of look at their framework and kind of what they're to do.
Yeah, my internet was very slow today too.
Mm-hmm. Well, imagine a picture of Bristol back in 1982 when it was very sad. Is it easier if
Maybe look on our own. Let's see.
Yeah, we have actually right here.
Okay. Apologize.
Yeah, we can try having Kate do it.
Okay.
It's coming up pretty quickly on my device, so I don't know.
So should I just unshare?
Sure, yeah.
So somebody else should be able to share. So thank you. So here's this picture of Bristol that I was describing before. This is a picture of Bristol from, I think, the late 80s, maybe early 90s. And, you know, our work is focused on kind of turning these frowns around. It's place-based economic development. These are our historic centers. They're places that we should have pride in. These are places that should be active and vital and dynamic. And I don't know, this picture from Bristol from the 80s is not a place where I'd want to start a family or a business or live in. And then next slide this is a picture of Bristol today. So Bristol did not look like it did in the prior slide overnight, and nor did it come back to become an active, vital community that it is in this slide overnight either, but it did happen amazingly quickly. And a big part of it is the state designation programs, the framework where we try to target the limited amount of money that we have investing into these centers, because they're areas that, you know, they're part of our brand, our culture, our economy. And the designation programs are the vehicle to channel the funding into these communities. Next slide. We have lots of different designations, and they were created at different times for different purposes. The initial focus was on just community revitalization, kind of Main Street improvement. And that began with the downtown program. That program's about 25 years old. I think this year we're celebrating its 25th anniversary. The primary benefit there was tax credits to fix up historic buildings. It For several years, we designated communities, and the smaller towns said, what about us? You're not doing anything for us. So we created a village center designation program. And that is the easiest designation of all of our designations to get. That's why we have 230 of them total. Somebody raised a certain former Secretary of State from South Burlington said, this is great and all, but there's nothing for my town, South Burlington, that has no traditional center. We were created after, there was no historic center. So what are you doing for us? So a new town center program was created. We have 3 communities with new town center designations. These are kind of community core designations. So the central business district is what we designate. And I'll show you images of these so you see what they look like on the land. Then there's overlay kind of larger area designations. And the 2 add-on designations are the neighborhood development areas, which are focused on tools and resources to improve and support housing development. And then there's growth centers. And there's 6 of those. So next slide is probably a very bad visual metaphor, but it seems to work. And so I'm stuck to it, is an egg. So imagine the center of the egg, the yolk of the egg is your core area. It is your downtown, your village, or your new town center. And the white is the surrounding lands around it that are developed. So that is your new town, your neighborhood development area or your growth center. Make sense? All right, moving on. I'm hungry now. I didn't need lunch. All of our centers are mapped. There's the state planning atlas, and you can zoom in on your community, all the communities in your district, and look at their designation. It's pretty cool. There's other information. You can turn it on and off layers to get information on natural resources. It's a pretty amazing tool, so I encourage you to check it out. If you want to see which communities in your district are designated, check this out. Next slide. The decisions about who designates are made, and their linear boundaries or delineated boundaries on the land are made by the Vermont Downtown Development Board. And it's a board made up of largely of kind of state agency heads or their designees, also representatives from local government, representatives from the environmental community and historic preservation, and also community planners. And we meet pretty much every month or every other month to review designations and to make decisions on benefits like tax credits or other reinvestment incentives. Next slide. We've been doing this for a while, and I guess the amount of land that we've designated is relatively small relative to the entire size of the state. So I don't need to read these to you, but just this gives you a sense of kind of the total land area. These are not big geographies. These are highly constrained geographies of what we designate. Next slide. And once you're designated, you're eligible for specific benefits. The downtown and village center tax credits, because the economics of fixing up buildings aren't quite what they should be. There needs to be a subsidy to make these projects happen. Downtowns, to be a fun place to live, need to have amenities. So you need to have good sidewalks, you need to have bike racks, you need to have places to sit. So the Downtown Transportation Fund pays for the incentives that make our downtowns walkable and bikeable. Since until recently, we didn't have much money to offer our communities for the designation. What many of our sister agencies do is make the designated areas a priority for their grant program. So if V-Trans looking at a biped program investment, they say, oh, you're in one of our designated centers, they get additional points. If A&R is looking at a water wastewater improvement and it's in one of these centers, they get due consideration. So it helps align our sister agencies to make investments in these centers. Until recently, we didn't see many new buildings going into our downtowns. We have a sales tax reallocation program that supports the infrastructure needed to support new development. There's reductions in fees, water, wastewater fees, Act 250 fees. They're exempt from land gains taxes, and then Act 250, which I'll talk about in a second. Next slide, please. If you have one of these designations, over time, Act 250 has begun as recognized. They weren't intended to be geographies for deregulation. I think you've heard from other people, they've just become that de facto over time because everybody agreed, most people agreed, These are areas we'd like to see and concentrate development in. As Kathy Beyer mentioned, one of the major benefits of being in one of these centers is exemption from Act 250 if you're a priority housing project. Percentage of your units has to be affordable, and if you're located in a downtown, new town center, growth center, or neighborhood development area, your project can be exempt from Act 250. There's presumption of compliance with 9L. I'm sure you've probably heard Act 250 has a bunch of criteria. There's a sprawl criteria, 9L. If you're located within a center, you meet those criteria for all centers. You pay a reduced fee for ag soil mitigation within your centers because these are areas usually with sewer and water. These are probably not areas where we're going to have farms. So they reduce those fees in those centers. And then many projects happen in centers, but they may not be eligible because they're not a priority housing projects. They can get reduced fees from their water wastewater connection permit and also from Act 250. Next slide. Kathy again mentioned priority housing project. It's been really effective. It's been super helpful to our affordable housing partners in speeding their permitting process and reducing the risk of their projects. This is the Bright Street Co-op that Rep. Logan lives in that I think she's mentioned. In the past, I guess, 5 years, this is according to NRB, over 2,700 units located within centers were exempt from Act 250. This saves about 6 months in permitting time, but I think and some fees and some costs, but the real benefit is reduced risk. It's often harder to develop in these centers, and if you can reduce your risk, you can make the project feel more feasible. Next slide. And there's a lot of good environmental benefits for investing in our centers. People who live in our centers drive a whole lot less. Not only does this reduce emissions, this means you have more time to be with your family. Not sitting in a car means you can get outside and exercise. Next slide. The challenge is, and Vermonters were surveyed, if you could live in one of these compact centers, would you live there? And a large majority of Vermonters would like to live in one of these centers. They would like to have those opportunities and options, but there's very few housing options for them. Thus the bill, where we're trying to align our public investments, our regulations, and our programs to make more housing options within these centers. I'm going to pause there, and then I'm going to go through just specifics of the different designations so you can see the relative land areas and what they look like in the land.
Okay. Are you planning to talk about how you approve these?
Yeah, there's an application process for each of these. Each one has statutory criteria that defines what a downtown, new town center, what the programmatic requirements are. We always sit down with communities prior to designation. So a village center wants designation, we go meet the community members, we sit down with the select board, talk about the community and what would be in and outside of the village center. We assist largely with regional planning commissions, communities with the application. Applications are reviewed by staff. We write staff reports, and then they're scheduled for the downtown board review, and then they're approved. The different requirements for the different programs vary, but that's the central process for all these different designations. Village centers are the easiest. On the opposite end is growth centers, which is the most complex.
Representative Baumgart.
Just to follow up with the chair's question a little bit, how do the boundaries get set for like a village center or a designated downtown? What are some of the things that I know they're very compact? Mm-hmm. What makes them compact?
It's driven by the statutory definition, of what a downtown is, and both downtowns and village center designations, as I think of the yoke. The statutory definition and precedent said just grab the commercial buildings within the centers. So there, in every community, you'll see this edge where the commercial area starts bleeding into larger scale multifamily, and then it's usually single family. So we cut it out at that boundary of where they start switching over. That's why we do go visit the community in person. So we want to see it on the land, what it looks like, and see where that cutoff is. And candidly, it's a frustration from communities because they don't see our statutory definitions applied on what they think is their town or their village. We're cutting off just a little piece of it. We're just following the law, but it is a tension point and kind of, it's something that we do want to take a look at when we do these designation review and come up with recommendations. We'd like to designate the whole community because that needs to all work together.
And then you actually, in a way, can't designate one to do the NDAs, but you'll get to that.
Right.
So, okay.
So can you just explain, you said, oh, village center is easiest. What makes it easier or more what rigorous?
Yeah, so village centers don't, they don't need to have zoning. Many of them do. And it's just, the requirements are that you have to recognize the village in your town plan. That is kind of a burden for some towns because they don't always update their town plan. So it has to be in the town plan that their intent to recognize this area and pursue the designation. That's really the biggest part. And then delineating the boundary and then actually filling out the application and creating the map of the district. So that is pretty easy. But the only benefit or the primary benefit they get is recognition in other state agency grant programs and the downtown and village center tax program. They're not recognized in Act 250 because they don't have, many of them just don't have the staff capacity to administer that. So we're just aimed at fixing up the core area of the community with these tax credits. Downtowns requires more work. Downtowns requires communities create a nonprofit entity to support the designation. We found if you just fix up the building and there's not a commitment to figuring out who should be in these businesses and what kind of makes the vital downtown happen, our money is not well used. You can have a lot of nice buildings that you just don't have a whole community. They need to have design review. They don't necessarily have to have zoning, but for practical purposes, any community that has design review has zoning. Really, the biggest barrier for the downtown groups is just creating that nonprofit organization. There's a lot of reasons we want it. Many municipalities support the downtown groups, but we also want them accountable to the downtown businesses. And they need to be able to raise funding and they need to be able to listen to the businesses and be held accountable to them. So we want to make sure that there is an independent group that is not reliant on government to support the downtown. Oftentimes, governments change and we want to make sure that when the winds blow in another direction, we still have a local partner to support the local revitalization work. Newtown Center, very, very complex. It kind of gets into, since they don't have a town, what are the town's regulations and policies to ensure when things do get built, they will be built in a walkable format. They will have bike and pedestrian amenities that will grow in a way that's consistent with a traditional settlement. And on and on and on. But the complexity varies depending on what the goal of the program is.
I appreciate your wanting to be brief, but I also, because the neighborhood development areas are a linchpin in this, if you could.
Yeah, so I have a specific slide that talks about that. So I think I can answer your questions with these next couple of slides. I hope to. All right, next slide. So we have 24 designated downtowns. Hardwick is our recent graduate. They were a village center. They moved up to a downtown designation, I think last month. It's our larger principal communities. I think there is a designated downtown in every part of the state, I think with the exception of maybe Essex County and Grand Isle County. So in many communities, I have multiple centers within their counties. As I mentioned, they have to have a local nonprofit organization with funding and staff to support the local revitalization activities. The boundaries are delineated much like they are for village centers. We just hit the commercial core. And the next slide shows a few examples of what this looks like. So our largest downtown is Burlington. And you will see, it is the core commercial area of Burlington. We're all familiar with it, but it doesn't designate any of the surrounding neighborhoods. Our smallest downtown is Bristol. Here again, it just designates the commercial area. It does not include any of the neighborhoods that surround. Next slide is village centers. Again, pretty easy to get this designation. It is just targeted at community revitalization, so tax credits to fix up existing buildings and additional grants and programs to fix up what they have. It's not really about building things new, it's fixing up what you have. They are all over the state. Many communities, while we've blocked in the whole town, they're very just narrow geographies within those centers. Many communities have more than one village center. So the next slide, you'll see the scales we look at. One shows Richmond as one of our larger village centers. Arguably, they could be a downtown if they wanted to pursue it. This is a village center designation. Again, best picking up the areas, around the Four Corners, Route 2, and the main and Bridge Street, which is kind of essentially their main street. But it excludes all the housing that surrounds it. The smallest village center, I think it's still the smallest, I may be wrong, is Maple Corner in Calais. And it just picks up the Maple Corner store and a few residential mixed, multifamily properties around there. But again, there's a lot more. They're there around the village, but we don't designate the houses. So next one is Newtown centers. And really, I think our biggest success was South Burlington, where the U-Mall was. There was a lot of land adjacent to that where they had envisioned for many years to create a Newtown center. They're actually building it out now. It started with Trader Joe's and Pier 1. And then if you look back behind there, they built a new library. They are slowly building this out, and it is amazing to see. Many multifamily housing units have gone up in those centers, many providing affordable housing close to amenities. Other Newtown centers are Berlin, and they're working hard to kind of redevelop their mall. It's kind of a sprawl. I think I see it as a sprawl repair designation. Like they have the infrastructure, the road, sewer, water is there, but the use is dying. So how can we reuse this land in a productive way? Getting to your question about the neighborhood development areas, the scale is different depending on the community. We create these buffer areas that I think you heard Charlie Baker talk about. So around a core designation. So on the left, you'll see a downtown. There's a half-mile buffer where we say, look in this area, look at your development pattern, look where you're built out. Where are your homes? And based on the facts on the ground, they actually usually narrow this down, but they also can come larger, and they actually delineate a neighborhood area. So there will be an area surrounding this. I think I've had this. It's a smaller scale for village centers. It's only a quarter-mile buffer, but they go through a similar process to identify the neighborhoods where they'd like to see Act 250 benefits support housing in and around their village center. Most neighborhoods, all of them today, also designate the center itself, so it lays on top of the underlying designation. So with that designation, the Act 250 benefits, the recognition for Act 250 goes over the entire. Next slide.
Just before you go,
yeah.
Just for people, because I kind of got this at one point in a way that I hadn't when you said it one way, and it's that the area around the red are kind of automatic. You said it, I think, which was to say it again, automatic areas of half a mile for designated downtown, quarter mile for a village center. And then with the meeting between the department and the community, they get adjusted a little bit around the edges, in or out a little bit, depending on, but you always start with the automatic planning area of either half a mile or a quarter of a mile, depending on which it is, and then it gets adjusted.
And it's just a buffer. It is just like, look here, like Burlington's, neighborhood planning area, half of it's in Lake Champlain, so we've adjusted there just on the facts on the ground and kind of elongated it to recognize their development pattern. But the intent around here is, these are areas that are walkable. These are areas where we would like to see housing go. These are areas close to services. Next slide. I don't have examples, but we now have 12 neighborhood development areas. GEMS is coming in with their application, and Rutland City is coming in with their application at our next board meeting. So the program is getting effective. A lot of the conversations that we've had around housing need, a lot of the bylaw grants that you supported also helped communities update their bylaws. That's really the key constraint to more communities achieving the neighborhood area designation, that their bylaws have to be consistent with the program's goal and has to support density, has to support a traditional neighborhood design that is pedestrian oriented. It has to be, they have to think through complete streets. It has to be, there has to be a network that allows people to walk and bike from that neighborhood to the center. And they have to go through an analysis to avoid important natural resources. And of course, we don't want them building in dangerous areas. So we have to make sure that there are standards in place. So if building does happen in these areas, that it is flood safe. It's looking at bylaws and reviewing bylaws is a very intensive, difficult process. We've had to hire additional staff to support this analysis, but I'm glad that more communities are moving in this direction. I would love to have 50 of these neighborhood areas designated. A little bit of the provisions in the bill that you're looking at now are kind of inspired. You see this, minimum density. These are areas typically with sewer and water. We want to be able to support those densities because that's what's needed to support public transit. If you don't have those densities, transit just doesn't work. Next slide. Finally is growth centers. This is a program that, it's been on the books for 20 years. This is the most intensive and rigorous of our designations. It recognizes that not everything that you want in a community is going to fit within a compact center. And so it asks communities to go through a visioning process for imagine where all your growth and needs are going to be within the next 20 years. It is through extensive bylaw review, it is a rigorous process. We only have 6 because back when the program was created, there was a large grant that went along with it to help communities achieve this designation. I think communities, there were $80,000 grants. We haven't seen, since the money's dried up, we haven't seen any of these designations. You can see on the map where they are located. Different lays of the land, but they played out differently. And the next slide shows a few different examples. One is in St. Albans, and the other is in Bennington. This is St. Albans Growth Center. So in the middle, that is their designated downtown, and surrounding it is their designated growth center. Beyond that is St. Albans town. So they are a very tight geography for their growth center. The other example is Bennington, which is a much larger growth center. It is, and again, the middle is their designated downtown district, and the lands surrounding it are where they imagine or where they'd like to see the next 20 years of growth occur. Outside these areas, as part of this designation, is protections for natural resources. So again, we're trying to ask communities to where they want to make everything fit for the next 20 years. I think some of the assumptions about growth in this program were not realistic. And therefore, I think we got some very large boundaries as a consequence. But if another example, Williston is a growth center. And, every year they have to come in and not every year, every 5 years, they have to come in and kind of report on how they're doing. The majority of growth in Williston, which is a growing community, does happen within the center. So it has been an effective tool. Is it the most effective tool and the easiest tool? No. That's why we only have 6 of them. So going forward, again, I hope you can see they were created for different times for different purposes. But what we're really trying to look at is where are our existing settlement areas? What programs can we create? What incentives can we create to get the bylaws in line with our larger development goals? And how can we help them achieve, kind of meet communities where they're at, what's a village center and what does it need versus what is a more sophisticated community and what are their needs to help them move along in this process. And the last slide is we just hired.
Vermont, what is the benefit to a community for the growth centers?
Priority housing project it was envisioned as trying to align it with the Act 250 criteria, but it never quite made it. Act 250 exemptions within those centers never really occurred. So the major benefit is a much larger area for priority housing exceptions. We also get priorities in state grants, but I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze. It is helpful that the community's bought into it. They have this framework. They're using it to shape local development, but the state level benefits that come with it are not commensurate with the amount of work required to keep it.
And I believe we have an expired one in my town.
You do know Middlebury.
We had one.
You looked at one, and I think the neighborhood, you have an NDA, you have a downtown and a neighborhood. It may be before my time, they may have looked seriously at it and didn't pursue it.
Yeah. When did your time start?
I've been doing this job for about 10 years.
It was before your time.
Okay.
I did have one. I was when I was on our planning commission. But I had one more question about, you sort of say like we, and there's the Vermont, there's the Downtown Development Board. Is that who the sort of deciders are?
Yep.
And how do they get appointed?
So it varies. Several of the members are members of the administration or their designees. So the head of VTrans, the head of A&R, our agency, our chair is Josh Hanford, commissioner of the ACCD, but it's the commissioner or their designee. Other groups are appointed, like we have a rep from the Chamber of Commerce. They recommend a slate of 3 folks every year. They all have kind of different processes for how they nominate their members, but our external members are nominated from these groups. VLCT has a rep on the board. They just select their member. There's a member from the Preservation Trust and VNRC. Every so many years, they recommend a slate of 3 people. We get a point from them. So it really depends on the organization. Vermont Planners have a rep, Chip Sawyer, who you'll hear from tomorrow. He's on our downtown board, and he's a representative from the Vermont Planners organization. So depending on who wants to do the job and who's available, they all bring a member to that board.
They bring the member, or you said they put a slate forward and you pick?
Well, it really depends. There's different processes for different, like administration folks, they select who they want or who designee are. For the chamber and for VNRC and PTV, they nominate a slate. For VLCT, the planners group and the RPCs, they just send us who their member rep
So
is.
they nominate a slate. Who's picking?
So for VNRC and the Preservation Trust, they recommend 3 members to the governor, and the governor picks a list of 3. Same for the chamber. They're a different process from these other groups that just say who wants to do the job, who's skilled, who can represent us.
And are those differences in statute?
Yes.
Okay.
And I would say there's an opportunity to make that a little bit more fair. We were just looking at our board, the representation of women and geographic distribution is not ideal. The representation of BIPOC individuals is not ideal either, because we can't control the process. We get the member who is given us. So that's something that when we take a look at our designation, we'd like to take a look at our board and how it's selected.
Yeah. Okay. Did you have a question? Representative Bongar.
Talk a little bit more about with the growth centers, the intent of lining it up with Act 250. And what was the thinking about how you would I'd hope this would unfold.
Yeah, and this was 20 years ago, so before my time. We haven't designated a growth center since I've been on the job. I believe the intent was, looking at the Act 250 criteria, it kind of like envisioned in your bill that enhanced designation process. Can we make sure that the community is looking at similar natural resource issues in the same way that Act 250 is? And if they do, then can we grant them a broader exemption? Can we delegate Act 250 authority to them? But it never meshed. I don't know. Brian Shoup was in the middle of it. He can tell you, the story about what worked and what didn't. But I think it was all parties were not in the same place, and I think the policy kind of suffered. So while we have this designation, it didn't really kind of meet everybody's vision of what it was going to achieve. The last slide is just we hired our consultants to assist us. I think I mentioned this the other day. Smart Growth America is our national smart growth leader, thought leader. And we also we're working with a local group called Community Workshop. They are expert at community and public engagement. We had our kickoff meeting with our consultant yesterday, and we're working on our plans to figure out how to talk to everybody, because everybody has an idea how the designation program should address their particular need or interests. So we plan to check in and hear from as many people as possible. We hired some local experts on the team too. Sharon Murray, I don't know if any of you know her. She was on the was she on the Act 250 Commission, or she spoke and presented to them. She's got a long history of land use in the state and is kind of a very well respected. She is an advisor on the project, doesn't have a ton of hours, but she's going to help us as well. And then a former staff member of ours who retired last year is also going to support this effort. Was involved in all the creation of all the designation programs, and she served as an Act 250 coordinator for many, many years. So I think we've got a really, really strong team. I think we have an internal vision for how we'd like to simplify the designation programs, working with all of our partners. But we need to listen to everybody else and figure out how we can build consensus around what Designation 2.0 will look like. There are some really good models out there. The state of Michigan has got some really creative ideas, and we're also taking inspiration from the state of Maine, figuring out where are these places and what do they need to kind of achieve our broader goals of economic vitality, housing. How can we support them? It's not cheap. So we are going to work with our sister agencies to make sure that they can, working with us to make the investments in the sidewalks, the bike lanes, the transit needed to kind of create sustainable, viable communities. That's all I got for now, but I'm sure you've got other questions.
Sure, we will. If we don't now, we will. Thank you for your testimony.
Just picking up, Charlie Baker made some recommendations about changes to the bill. I think many of them we would agree with and support. There's a few others that I just want to highlight that I think are some opportunities. As envisioned in your bill right now, there is a process for enhanced village center designation. I think it'll be very hard for many villages to achieve. I'd really like to see dedicated resources to help our smaller towns achieve the designation. Right now, we do have a process, but it doesn't really meet them when they're ready. We have an annual grant, and communities and planning commissions may not be ready when we have a grant round. So we'd like to be able to be more responsive to them and provide dedicated consulting resources to help our small towns achieve this designation. There's other changes as well. I'd be happy to kind of write up specific changes and get them to you, but mostly tweaks. I think the bill that came over from the Senate was in pretty good shape, but I think there's opportunities to make it better. Another one that just occurred to me was Jacobs, when we were last here, showed slides of Connecticut doing analysis of the statewide zoning. That process has started. We have a great team, project management led by UVM, working with the regional planning commissions, VHFA. They've already started working on zoning, gathering data, so we can post it on our planning atlas of kind of what these districts allow and to what intensity. I think it's going to be a really important tool to get at some of the questions that you're asking about where are the barriers and what are we seeing in communities. But especially going forward, if this bill is enacted, all of our communities are going to have to level set, kind of create a new baseline. But there's some discretionary changes that they're going to need to make. So it'll be really important, I think, to have a good map of what that is. Zoning, I don't know. I'm sure some of you have served on your local boards. It's pretty dense and it's pretty opaque. And to be able to kind of roll this all up on a statewide resources will be very, very powerful and helpful. We do a good job mapping, I think, natural resources and where we don't want to build, but I think we haven't done a good job mapping kind of where we'd like to build and what's enabled in the community. So those two pieces I think will work very well and should inform your conversations where you want to go next year with looking at place-based jurisdiction. So I think all these exercises will be helpful.
So where does that mapping exercise fit in?
Where does it fit in? Oh, so right now there is a provision in the bill where we're asking communities, right now, communities,
The zoning atlas.
right.
Oh, but that would be years in the coming. They would.
Now, well, they've got, as proposed in the bill, I mean, we're going to do baseline zoning mapping now. And if this bill passes, all communities are going to have to update their zoning. And we'd like to be able to keep this data fresh. Right now, we have a process where bylaws are updated to the state, but we don't get their zoning shape files. So that's a change that we'd like to see.
Oh, so you're seeing that happening pretty quickly, the zoning atlas or
Oh,
inventory.
yeah.
Well, I thought it would be as towns responded and updated.
No. We want to create a statewide map. They have an ambitious goal to get this done by the end of the summer. I think that's ambitious. But they have a pretty big team and they're making decent progress. But that's just going to be a static data set. So we need a process to ensure the data stays fresh. And that's, we've got language. There was language in H68 that was pretty good. We checked in with VCGI and they've got some specific changes they'd like to see to make it clear, just to make sure that when bylaws are updated, we can put it up on this map.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, members, we are going to shift gears.
The project in Rutland.
Oh, Rutland City is coming in with a neighborhood development area designation. Yeah.
I'm gonna have to find out what that is.
Yeah,
So we're going to shift gears
absolutely.
and go into amendments on S5. But what I'd like to do is take a 5-minute break. And but that's what we're going to do. We're going to take up amendments in 5 minutes.